Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us with Browns Residencies. I'm Lynette Nylander. I am a writer based in New York, and I'm super excited to be in conversation with someone I admire greatly for their candidness and their candor and overall amazingly funny and irreverent personality, Karley Sciortino. Karley is a writer. She is a sex and relationships columnist at Vogue. And she is the host of a documentary series about sexuality entitled Slutever. And we're going to get into a great personal conversation about sex and relationships, which I know is a really kind of prevalent topic in the age of COVID, because sex and relationships has basically been thwarted as we know it now. So I'm super excited to get into it with who I think is an expert on the matter. So yay. Karley, hi. I want to talk to you about how your quarantine's been. I know that you're living full-time in LA now after a move from New York. So tell me a little bit about how your quarantine's been and what you've been up to.
It's been, I was gonna be like, it's been good, but like, has it? I've been spending a lot of time in my house. I've gotten into hiking, right? Like, I was like, what's an outdoor activity I could do that's good for my mental health and thighs at the same time? But yeah, I think like in terms of sex and relationships, it's been a really interesting period because I live with my boyfriend and, it's a struggle to be with someone 24/7 and you learn a lot about them, but then also you can say, okay, I want to be appreciative actually for the fact that we've gotten to spend so much more time together than we ever would have. So I think people in relationships are during this time often like, you can easily complain and be like, oh my God, I have no space. But I think we're not going to get through this unless we can find like the good in everything that we're experiencing.
Right. I feel like it's been a crash course for most people that I know of that have been in relationships, in that you either have realized how much you love and care about the person, and you've actually gotten the chance to really get to know them in the way that modern life doesn't always allow you to, or it's really highlighted some fundamental differences and maybe complexities in some of my friends' relationships. Do you think you've seen the same in people that you know?
Totally. Like right at the beginning of the pandemic, we were like a month in, and my therapist said this thing that was really true. She was like, this period is the great intensifier. Like it doesn't cause problems that are like that aren't already there, and it doesn't like create new great things. It just like highlights and intensifies everything that already exists. So like the problems in your relationship, like you can't hide them anymore, and like the ways in which you are great at connecting are even more useful and you appreciate them even more. So, and, at the end of this, there'll be more divorces, but also more marriages and more babies. And I think that I really have felt that is true.
Yeah. Everybody I know ever, I feel like who has like a womb is pregnant. Everybody I know who is in a relationship right now has used this time to get knocked up, which I think is amazing and fab. But I agree. I think you know how we've lived through different generations of time, like the baby boomers and this and that. I feel like we're going to have this very specific boom of babies in that were born in 2020 and 2021, and probably 2022 also, if that were really specifically tied to what, having absolutely nothing else to do. I kind of want to take it back with you, because what I really admire is your ability to normalize conversations about sex and relationship in a kind of like I've coined it like an anti-Carrie Bradshaw way, not in this kind of like stylized way. You're really candid. You're kind of like how I would like to speak about sex and relationships if I was a little bit more brave. And I want to talk to you about if you've ever if you ever hesitated about being so candid about speaking about, you know, your own personal experiences, and were you always like that even when you were younger?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, I've been hesitant. I mean, I started it by accident, truly. I started my blog Slutever back in 2007 when blogs weren't really a thing. I was like 21. There wasn't the example of like the successful, professional, famous blogger or whatever. So I was writing this blog and I was like, no one's going to read this. No one cares about my stories about having sex with drunk farmers in high school. And so I was kind of teaching myself to write, you know, with the audience of my friends at the beginning and really divulging a lot. And then it caught on and it kind of, I realized it was really a learning experience because I think that being, you know, like naked, so to speak, emotionally, being vulnerable is the most amazing tool for connection. So I realized that this was sort of the superpower, in a sense, that was making people interested in my writing, and that I could either like keep doing that for a larger audience and be okay with that, or that I think my writing wouldn't have been as effective as it was. And I think also, you know, as a writer, you're lucky in that you're like behind your computer alone in your room. And so you're like, it doesn't feel like you're talking to an audience, you know, you like say this, you're all this embarrassing stuff about yourself. And then you can kind of like upload and walk away and forget, you know, that you told somebody about your frail threesome.
I can completely identify with that, because a lot of the time I think you passively write things and almost expect that no one will ever read them and there'll be no consequence. And I think you're completely right in that some of the more personal things, you know, I have kind of a dual life as a writer, in the sense that I interview personalities and I sometimes write personal kind of essays and things. And I think when you write things that are more personal, you always elicit, I'm always shocked about the response that it elicits. But yeah, I want to kind of talk about something you kind of just specifically said about, you know, it being 2007 and that idea of like a professional blog, and never mind someone who talks about sort of sex and relationships, wasn't even a thing. And so do you find now, in contrast, you know, these conversations have become more prevalent, but sometimes they can feel a little bit like a box checking thing, you know, if brands do it or if publications do it. Right. Do you sometimes feel, you know, frustrated, or do you feel validated that people are having more open conversations about sex and relationships?
I mean, I think that it's wonderful, right? Like, I don't think that there is a negative to people being more open and talking more about sexuality. I mean, when I was growing up, I don't think that there was a conversation happening, at least that I was aware of, about like generic, like here's a generic example, just like female sexual pleasure, like how to make sex feel good for you, right? Where I was reading Cosmo, like 195 tips on how to please your man in bed or whatever. Yeah. So I think that is incredible. And I think that people are just like, I just give audiences so much credit. And I think people know when it's like, oh, we're checking the sexuality box. You know what I mean? It's like, from a brand, I think people can like suss out inauthenticity so quickly. And I think now more than ever, it's like, oh, you know, we have, you know, in our ad campaign, we have like a trans person and like a mixed race person and a queer person. And it's like, okay, we're not stupid, and we understand when something is being commodified, and when someone is being authentic. And I think that like in sex writing, I think that there's a lot of like, there's like two sides of the coin. There's some like really like braggy, like, oh, I'm telling this really, I'm being really open, but actually it's a sort of guess how, like, oh, look how good my sex life is. Or it's like fear mongering. Like there's still a sort of avenue in the media where it's like not fear mongering as much as like negative voyeurism, like, oh my God, look at these like weirdos who hang out in dungeons or whatever it is.
Right.
And I think that at the center of that, there's so much more writing about personal experience that allows the audience to sort of just, like feel more normal through someone else's experience.
Totally. I completely agree. And what do you think there is left to normalize when it comes to conversations around sex and relationships? Or do you think the door's been cracked wide open?
I think there's a lot, right? Like, I think what we were just talking about where, speaking about female sexuality, because it's something that, I write about, that there's been huge advances in terms of like the empowerment narrative and like the pleasure narrative, where it's like, right, everyone's a feminist with their vibrator and like I masturbate and like I have multiple sexual partners and all these things are great in terms of normalizing that. But I do think still like everybody's learning to normalize like the parts of sex that are not so great, like things that make us feel insecure, like, do I have enough sex with my partner? Like we haven't had sex in months. What does that mean about our relationship? Or like, right. I can't come during sex, or like talking about erectile dysfunction or whatever. Like the ways in which we feel like we don't like meet some criteria about like what good sex is or what sexual enlightenment is. I think, of course, we find it difficult to talk about that stuff.
Yeah. And I think it's such a shame, because I think those are the things that that are way more common. And the taboo should definitely like be broken around all of that stuff. I want to talk a little bit specifically about sex in the age of COVID. I want to talk about, how and what are some of your tips about maintaining a level of intimacy around sex and relationships when fundamentally our minds are kind of taken over by this crazy thing that has never happened to all of us before. A lot of friends and a lot of people I know and myself have not even been in a feeling where we want intimacy or closeness with other people. Like, what are some of your tips about kind of moving through that and navigating through that?
Well, just to start in terms of normalizing, there have been studies that show that across the board, people are having less sex in, 2020, since this all started. I was doing this podcast at the first few months of all of this, and I interviewed this guy, Dr. LaMiller, who's a sex researcher at the Kinsey Institute, and he was saying like, whether you're single or, you were casually dating someone at the beginning of this, or you're in a long-term relationship, like people across the board are reporting less sex. So I think that is helpful to just know, because you're like, oh, okay, it's not just me, and this doesn't mean that there's something wrong with my relationship. And I think you shouldn't push yourself to act like you would in normal times or whatever. I think you have to do what feels authentic. I think in terms of intimacy, from my own experience, living with a partner, it's creating sort of like space and boundaries is the greatest thing I think you can do. It's like treating yourself like you are, like I'm at work in this room, and, if you want to talk to me, just text me, pretend I'm not in the house. You know what I mean? And like, but then like blocking out times when you do hang out, like, okay, let's have dinner together. Like as if you are operating in a normal life, like really creating space for each other. Right. And then, did you ask about single people too? Is there a question about?
Yes, totally.
Just about like how to generate or like how to maintain intimacy?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. I think that can work both ways. I think that can be, with yourself, or, if you want to casually date. Obviously, we're going to get into dating apps and that kind of whole kind of technology-based element. But yeah, I definitely think my question applies to single people too.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's hard not to go into like dating apps and stuff like that in this question. Yeah. I think that what I have seen is so interesting in the ways that people are getting creative in terms of connecting with people, because obviously we still need that, but most people don't feel comfortable obviously dating in the same way that they were before. And I think like there's something that's really sexy about not being able to touch somebody. I mean, this is probably maybe sounds like a troll to someone who's like desperate to touch somebody, but like when my friends talk about going on social distance dates, which a lot of them are, like they just talk about like building up that tension. And what is something that I think is extremely interesting about this period of time is like, you know, speaking about all the ways that we've progressed as a society when it comes to sexuality, like more than ever, women and men can like are allowed to sort of have the sex life they want without shame, have multiple sexual partners, and do so without really fear, right?
Yeah.
In that gain, I feel like we have to also acknowledge that we've lost something, which is like the experience of long-term courtship. Like so many people of our generation don't know what it's like to date someone for weeks or months without sleeping with them or like going, you know, having some sort of sexual interaction, of like potentially being in love with somebody before that happens. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, the women I know like sort of in a joking but also reality way identify as like sluts or slutty, right? And I have one friend who's like, I'm a slut, and like I, for the first time, had this experience of dating someone for a month before sleeping with them. And like, I never would have had that if I wasn't pushed to by this period of time. And it was like so wonderful. And does that mean that I want to do that in every relationship going forward? Not necessarily, but it's a really valuable experience to have. And I think people are really learning a lot about themselves and their sexual impulses through that experience.
And what do you think that kind of I call it incubation, but that kind of courtship period can do if, you know, if it turns into something a little bit more long term? Like, what I mean by that is I think a lot about our parents' kind of generation of dating, where, you know, I've listened to stories where, you know, the idea of courtship was very much built into the narrative arc of a relationship. You know, it wasn't kind of how it is now. And it's kind of, I don't know, that's kind of like an old school notion, but there is something kind of, I guess my more romantic side of me does think that there's something really nice about it. And I guess I want to know what you think is beneficial about it.
Totally. I feel like it's the kind of thing our moms were telling us from teenage years, and we're like, oh, Mom, you're so old and you're an idiot, you know? And then you're like, wait, does she have the answer the whole time? But no, I don't, like, of course, just to set this up, I don't think it's always, like, I don't think it's bad to sleep with someone early on if that feels right for you. But I think, like, as a default, and as thinking like, this is what the pace of a relationship is now in modern times. And like, I'm a modern, empowered, sex positive woman, and I don't wait to have sex. You know what I mean? I think it, like, the pendulum has swung so far that this is what we some people just like assume happens. Me. But I think that there's something in the times that I have waited, and I'm thinking of one example where the guy said, I don't feel comfortable sleeping with people until I feel really close with them. So we went like over a month seeing each other before doing that. And I think it made me realize that how I use sex sometimes is like a crutch instead of really connecting with someone in a different way. Like if you're at a bar and there's a lull in the conversation, you can just like touch someone's thigh and like start making out. You know what I mean? Or like, you know, I sometimes feel like I am more afraid of like an awkward silence than I am with like having sex with someone I barely know. And it's like, what is my impulse? And then like but then without sex, without that crutch, what happens if you're just talking, right? What happens if you're just looking at someone? Where does your conversation go? How, like, do you have to, like, what am I trying to say? Like, I think sex for me sometimes has been a shortcut to intimacy, right? And if you don't have that shortcut, if you can't jump to the future, then what ways do you connect? And do you have to make yourself vulnerable in different ways? And I think that that is a good skill to have in life.
In life, yeah, totally. Way beyond kind of dating and dating as it pertains to the pandemic. I completely agree. I want to talk about dating apps because, of course, they have become even more prevalent in quarantine. It was largely the only way a lot of people were connecting with other people, and the apps kind of jumped in completely on it. Making video chat enabled on it, the whole nine. Like, what have been some of the stories you've heard about sex and relationships as it pertains to kind of social media and dating? Some of the best stories, I should say.
Well, something I think is interesting is like that, I read that a lot of these dating apps were doing studies of the way that people were engaging with the apps. And something that was cool is that often at the beginning of like pre-COVID, the way that people interact when they match is sort of like they don't say anything, or it's like sup, and then it's just kind of like small talk. Whereas right from the beginning, everyone's going through such an intense emotional experience that people were getting like really real with each other really fast. And I think that people were so desperate for connection that, you realize the potential of what you're giving people that you never would give a chance, and finding like that was really fruitful. And then also, obviously, people were increasingly having like FaceTime sex or FaceTime sexual experiences. And what I think is something I thought was really interesting and what people were telling me was that the people who got to the point where they were doing that sometimes FaceTime sex felt more vulnerable than real sex.
Yeah.
Real sex. And I think FaceTime sex is real sex, but IRL sex. And I think because like in real life, you can kind of go to a bar and get a little tipsy and go back to someone's house and like turn the lights off and like sort of like fumble into bed and like turn around and like not even be looking at them, when you're having sex, and like that being forced to sort of look into someone's eyes. It's like, I didn't grow up on that. What I mean?
Oh, no, totally. I actually weirdly think there's way more ability for distraction in real life scenario than there would be in a FaceTime scenario.
Totally. Like even in terms of conversation where there's like, if you're out at a restaurant or a party, it's always like, oh, look at that person. Or like, okay, let's look at the menu. And when you don't have any of that stuff, it's just like, you're really exposed. I mean, I'm sort of saying the same thing over and over, but you're totally right. Like you have someone's full attention and they have yours. And I don't know, like to me, FaceTime sex truly does sound scarier with a new person than sex in person. What do you think?
A guy from a dating app tried to FaceTime me the other day, completely without warning. I couldn't even pick up the phone. So I'm that girl. I'm someone who I'm a Virgo. So my ability is great when I know the setup, when I know the limits, but a level of spontaneity where someone might want, intimacy or closeness, I'm like, nah, which means that, yeah, this kind of new world that we're living in isn't really set up for, someone like me.
Like an assault.
Anyway, yeah. So, I mean, an idealistic notion, but let's talk about what we think things could look like post COVID, and we're going to be left through this with this really kind of unknown environment where this idea of closeness and connectivity and intimacy is going to feel a little bit more foreign to us. How and what do you think that dating is going to look like post COVID?
I think, I've been thinking about this a lot, where it's like when, once we're all vaccinated, is it going to be like the world is a giant sex party 24/7, or are we going to be going through a period of reticence? And I kind of think, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a profit, but I do feel like it will be both, to say something boring, like depending on the person. I know that, you know, there's this sex party NSFW in New York that's sort of like this notion, maybe you know about it, but they were doing virtual sex parties all through the pandemic, and they were like, we never expected them to be as big as they were. Like people were tuning in like Tel Aviv at 9 a.m. to go to like a virtual orgy. And there was like hundreds and hundreds of people that were going. And then when cases got really low in New York over the summer, like people were like taking risks to go to these parties in person. And I think like people had so much pent up sexual energy that I was like, I never would have imagined that. But I was like, really? Like you went through the trauma of COVID in New York? Like I would have assumed that you would be like very hesitant to go back to even dating. Mm-hmm. But I think that in terms of like that, how much sex you're having and how connected you are with someone and how much intimacy you're having drastically affects your mental health. Like we know that that's a fact.
Yeah, that's a fact. Yeah.
You're taking the risk of like, I think people are being forced to take the risk or push themselves to sleep with people or connect with people. It's like weighing against your physical health or mental health, which is like a horrible position to be in. But I think I got like really dark there. But I do think that there will be sort of a mini sexual revolution after this is over. Like even in someone in a relationship, like I was like, the first thing I'm going to do when I can leave the house is like run to like the world's most crowded bar and be within like sweaty, awkward, like proximity to strangers. Mm-hmm. Like, I just feel like we're going to want to touch each other. And there's something really exciting about that.
At dinner last night that came up with two girlfriends and we were like, the summer's going to be wild. It's going to be a sexual free-for-all. I think people have missed closeness. They've missed doing things without hesitation. And I think one of the things I've learned in quarantine is one thing that I did or I sat around doing was longing for all the times I'd said, no, I'm not going out. No, I don't want to sleep with this person. No, I don't want to go on this date. Like all of that kind of nervousness and neuroses and kind of like fearfulness is going to go out the window once we get an all clear from this. I just think that, and I know that's the feeling of my general friendship group and the loads of people I speak to in my friendship pockets around the world, is everyone is just so ready for the complete polar opposite of this. And I think in turn, that's going to make the next couple of years pretty interesting. I want to.
It's like, well, that sounds bad, but like not being able to have something makes it the most appealing thing in the world. Just to say, like, I grew up Catholic, being told like you can't have sex. It's like that was then my whole life was like I'm gonna have sex with anyone I can because I'm not allowed. I feel like it's gonna be like a ton of Catholic girls being like set loose on the world after this.
Yeah. I want to throw it to the viewers watching who have a lot of questions. So I'm going to read some questions from some of the submissions and you're going to help answer. So the first question is, I recently started seeing someone. He is the first person I have ever had a serious long-term relationship with, and I'm 25. It all has happened quite quickly, and I feel that I'm falling for him, but how do I know I'm actually in love?
Oh, wow. That's such an interesting question. I mean, it's like, okay, so I think sometimes we disregard love if it comes too fast, right? We're like, oh, that couldn't have been love because I was just a teenager, or that couldn't have been, like, we can't be in love because we've only known each other for 2 weeks. And I don't think that's true. I feel like I have often felt like the people that I truly love, that I was in long-term relationships with, my current boyfriend included, that I knew almost immediately. Yeah. It's something you really do just know. And I think like the experience that I have had, and I've heard other people report, is like when you're in love with someone, it's like the world shrinks down to like the size of their face. You know what I mean? That it's like someone is like completely taken hostage of your brain. And then, but that also with the simultaneous feeling of like, for me, like I want to like put my head under your t-shirt and just like live there forever. You know what I mean? It's a sexual feeling, but it's also like a non-sexual feeling. I feel like those two things connected feel like love versus just like, oh my God, I'm objectifying that hot person. I want to sleep with them. I think.
Yeah. And I also think it's such a difficult thing to quantify. I think only you know, but I would dispel the idea that being in love is this big truck that hits you, or something that's out of some sort of Jennifer Lopez rom-com. Like, it is really, I think it can burn slowly. I think I've identified I've been in love twice, and neither were people I was kind of expecting. So in turn, it kind of, the idea that I loved them kind of subtly came about. But I definitely think you're right in the sense that you always know when you've met someone who feels special. And I think that feeling is normally the kind of knowing.
It's like interesting because I do think that there is the slow burn, but I guess I've never had that feeling. And I always thought it was so interesting where it's like, is it like, I know this person, they're my friend, we work together, and it's like one day you turn around and you're like, oh my God, wait, I realized that I'm in love with you, but I've known you for 5 years. Like, is that what it's like? Because that to me feels harder to comprehend than feeling like you're in love with someone after like 45 minutes.
Yeah, no. Speaking from personal experience, it's not so. I found that it's not so much like, oh, like after 5 years. It's like I'm in with my experience. I was dating the two people. It was just like, oh, this is fun. I'm not so much reading into this, and then it kind of was like, oh, I like you a little bit more. Oh, I like you a little bit more. Oh, I like you a little bit more. But it wasn't like some huge thing that happened. I think for me, it's just a building. It was just like something that built up. But I think in our discourse, it's kind of proven there's no one way to knowing. And I guess the advice I would personally give is that, and I think it can happen after a day, it can happen after a year, it can happen after 5.
Totally. And there doesn't really seem that much like benefit in trying to talk yourself out of it. Like if you feel like you love that person, then that's a positive. You know,
right.
I mean, the thing is like love addiction, where you can start to feel like you are in love with every single person that you go on one date with, because you're like convincing yourself you're in love because you're sort of desperate for a connection. But this person doesn't seem like that's her MO. They're in a relationship. Seems like exciting.
Yeah. Next question. I cannot orgasm with my boyfriend. I feel myself getting close, but then for some reason I stop myself and hesitate away from that feeling of letting go. How can I overcome this, as it's really driving us apart because he feels he cannot satisfy me sexually?
That's a really hard one. Like what we were saying about before in terms of normalize, like what needs to be normalized. Yeah. This seems like the pinnacle of that, because this is so common. Especially for women, but like also for men, which people don't talk about. But I mean, like, this is why the fake orgasm is so pervasive among women, which is sad, but we've all done it. But basically, it's very normal to not be able to reach orgasm with a partner. I mean, like, from personal experience, I always used to make the joke that like when I was mostly throughout my 20s, when I was by myself, I could make myself come in like 45 seconds. But whenever someone else came in the room, like my vagina was like extremely antisocial and couldn't even get like close. Because I mean, it's all mental, right?
Yeah.
And putting pressure on yourself, then it's really, you're going to go in the opposite direction. Like if you're like, oh my God, if I don't come, there's something wrong with me. If I don't come, this is going to be bad for my relationship. Then you're less likely to get there. And I think that what it says is like, what she said is it's coming between me and my boyfriend because he feels like he can't satisfy me. It's like, I think that becomes like a problem. It sounds like he's putting pressure on her. And I think that they need to have a conversation where she's like, this isn't anything you're doing wrong. Because if his ego is like, it sounds like his ego might be getting in the way, because it's not this idea that like men hand orgasms to women on a platter with their skills. It's like, that's not how it works. It's like it's group effort, you know? And like being able to walk into a sexual experience and say like, I might not come this time and I might not come for months, but like eventually we'll get there. It's about creating a space where it's okay if it doesn't happen, which will make it ultimately more likely to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
yeah.
Yeah, it just sounds like it sounds like there's a lot of pressure, and in that pressure you're never going to find any pleasure. You know, I think maybe taking away the expectation would help ease the feeling a little bit.
Totally. And also like there's other ways to come. Like a lot of women can't come, most women can't come through penetration alone, right? And some with like, I think like I used to find it difficult to come. I mean, I think it's like it gets easier to come as you get older, which is like I feel like people are always like, your sexual peak is when you're 25 because that's when you're the hottest. And like this, like the secret is that like sex is but like as you feel, you know, more confident and in touch with your body, and like maybe the way that you guys can start to move toward having an orgasm during your sexual interaction is just like to masturbate, you know, like in front of your boyfriend or with your boyfriend, or have him help you or whatever. It's like coming during sex doesn't have to mean that you have like a movie version of an orgasm where you're like hopping up and down and just like screaming, you know, it doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah, I agree. The next question is, as a woman, why is there so much shame in masturbating? I have the voice in my mind that makes me feel like I'm doing something dirty or wrong. But once I get past that, I really enjoy it. How do I get past this internal monologue and really own my sexuality?
I mean, the annoying thing is like sometimes when something is wrong, it makes it even more fun. So like, maybe preserve some of that. Again, my Catholicism. But, you know, I think that like that there's so much shame about everything when it comes to sex, like particularly like, you know, if you're a woman who like female masturbation, there's been like so much shame and stigma around that for a long time. But I don't know, like this just sounds like such a basic answer, but just like to know that your brain, that we were like brainwashed and programmed to think something that's really just not true. You know what I mean? Like not beating yourself up for having that like residual shame, because we all have it, but just sort of knowing like this, like that I can get past this and that it won't always be there. And like, if you can get past it and enjoy yourself already, then like you're most of the way there. And
I think I totally identify with, I've been thinking a lot about learned experience when it comes to being a woman versus what I feel and what I know. And I think this is a perfect example of, this is some societal thing that has somehow infiltrated our everyday. And I know that I would say to this person, you are not the only person. I know lots of friends, lots of people in my life who kind of share that same sentiment. And I think it's just one of many messages we're sent as, someone who identifies as being a woman, that this is wrong, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. And ultimately, I mean, easier said than done, but that those feelings really need to be banished to the side, and it needs to be about your personal connection with what you're doing. Because I don't know, if we took on everything that everybody said was wrong or had an opinion on, we just never have fun and never do anything. Never do anything.
What you just said, I feel like I just have to respond to, like you were saying, thinking about learned experience versus lived.
Yeah.
That's so spot on. And I feel like you could apply that to literally every sexual behavior. You know, for example, you're told, don't have sex on the first date, right? And then it's like, I think like the key to a good sex life, which we've just stumbled on, is like checking in with yourself after things happen. You know what I mean? It's not like listening to the messaging, but like masturbating and saying like, well, what is my lived experience? Oh, this is really fun. Okay, then that I think that means that's right for me. Or it's like sleeping with someone on the first date, checking in with yourself. Actually, that felt not good. Okay, that's not for me. Because these things are all subjective, and what's right for somebody isn't right for someone else.
Right, exactly. And I think that's another thing that makes it all really challenging, is that everyone thinks there's one defined experience that we should all live through, and there isn't. You know, I completely respect someone who doesn't want to sleep with someone on the first date. I personally just don't have that that feeling ever. I just go with whatever feels natural to me in the moment, but I respect the idea if somebody doesn't want to. Someone has asked, are there more Slutever seasons on the way?
There aren't, because the channel I was doing it for, Viceland, like exploded and doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. But I have a mission to do another documentary sex show that I think will be coming in the not too distant future.
Fab. So. Wonderful. Okay. Another question is, do you think it's best to confront someone who you think might be ghosting you, or will they come to you if they want you? In your interview, you said people should just put themselves out there rather than complaining about how other people suck at it. But how does this work if you're already in it with them and then they go silent? If you confront them, what do you say?
Well, I think ghosting is really crappy. Like, I do think that the essence of it to me is sort of like, it's cowardly and it's immature. You know, I think that like sort of emotional maturity and just sort of personal maturity, even though it's hard, means being able to say, hey, well, I've been having a really good time with you, but actually this just like doesn't feel right for me, or whatever. But that's hard, and being avoidant of that, I think, says something negative about you versus the person being ghosted. So I think that if you're on the other side of it and that makes you, I think that's like a red flag and says something bad about the person you were dating. So you should take that into account. But also, my friend who's a sex educator, Dr. Jana Vrangalova, NYU, she said like that what she does when people have ghosted, which I thought was interesting, is basically just say like, hey, you know, you've ghosted me and that actually makes me feel really bad. And I would have, you know, I expected more after what we had together, but I just wanted to let you know that, bye, or whatever. And it's actually like being really open and vulnerable, but really conveying to the other person, really for the future of everyone they date, like, this feels really shitty. Maybe don't do that. But without being like, what's wrong with you? You're making it you know?
I've had conversations regarding ghosting with a particular friend of mine called Madeline, and I think the most annoying thing about ghosting is the idea or the expectation that that person can't hear the truth, is that they're somehow nervous, somehow are not emotionally strong enough to be able to take it. So somehow ghosting them is a kind of way of navigating through that, but it isn't. It just absolves the person who's doing the ghosting, and it's kind of selfish because it makes someone else feel shitty for your kind of shortcomings. I don't know. I'm a big proponent on not doing that. If you have, if you don't want to see someone anymore, I think that's completely fine and warranted. But I always think you have to do them the due diligence of just letting them know.
Totally. And you're totally right. Like putting it on them, it's like such rationalizing. It's like, oh, well, it's going to hurt their feelings to be let down. And it's like, you've left them in this like waiting game where your mind is in a spiral where you're like, what did I do? What did I say?
Right. It leaves them, you've left them you've kind of actually emotionally dragged them into your shit beyond, versus just kind of letting them letting them know and kind of having this separation, which I kind of personally think is even more annoying. I'm really, really sad because I could talk to you for a lot longer, but we have to wrap it up now. But do you have any kind of lasting final words as we go into the end of this year, the weirdest 2020, the weirdest year in recorded history, I think, or at least the weirdest year that I've been alive, as it pertains to kind of relationships and going forward and kind of looking to the future.
Okay, well, I'm going to say something probably cheesy, but I think that this year has been such a struggle for so many people. And, like sometimes you can feel bad complaining because there's always so many people who have it so much worse than you, right? Yeah. I think that we are not going to make it through this unless we can find and like be aware of the good things that happened. And then I think a good exercise for life, but also you could apply it to sex and relationships, is just to be like, what are 3 things that I feel really grateful for, or great moments, or things that I've learned about myself or relationships or sex this year, and force yourself to say them out loud or write it down or whatever it is, because it's so much easier to focus on the negative, and to be like, oh, I didn't have sex for 2 months, or oh, me and my boyfriend got in these horrible fights. But actively focusing on positives or learning experiences or whatever they are, sort of like, I don't know, it just like generates real appreciation. And I think it's worth doing.
Yeah. I think the most important thing is to not think that you've lost out on this year. I think, yeah, okay, maybe we haven't been able to get to know as many people as we would have liked, but I think it's not lost because you have this amazing opportunity to get to know yourself more. And that's really rare. And how often do we ever really get a chance to do that in a kind of concentrated way without so much interruption, in a way of trying to make, trying to see the good in what is obviously a pretty sucky time. But yeah, just trying to take time to get to know yourself better, which I think obviously is like the ultimate relationship, again, without being too cheesy. But thank you so much for having this very enlightened conversation with me. I know you've given me loads to think about in a lot, and in sex, in relationships, in connectivity, and how we think and speak and connect with one another. So thank you very much, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Karley, where can they find you on Instagram?
My Instagram is at Karley Slutever, Karley with a K and an E. And also you can read my writing on Vogue.com under the column Breathless.
And thank you so much to Browns for facilitating this conversation between me and Karley. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.